Return to Nuremberg. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Decision. The weather is not always nice in Chicago, especially as the calendar days start to really dwindle down and winter approaches. Maybe that's why no one of his friends really could understand why aging Judge Curtis Shake would pick that city, Chicago, as the place to which he would retire and live out the rest of his life. His unexpected decision to leave his lifelong home of Vincennes, Indiana, was very much a sudden surprise to everyone. Shake had grown up in southern Indiana, and except for some top-level assignments, had spent his entire adult life practicing law in that part of the state. He was an integral part of the area, part of the lore and the texture there, whether he liked it or not. As a matter of fact, by the time he had reached old age, it was hard to find anyone in his part of Indiana, or in neighboring Illinois for that matter, who had not heard his name. Most people in the area knew something of his past accomplishments and a little about his achievements. Few, though, actually knew much more than just that. For the most part, Judge Shake didn't care. He was a genuinely modest kind of man, very proud of the years of his multifaceted life, and he had few regrets, if any. Through all the long years, though, he never wore his fame on his sleeve. In many ways, Judge Curtis Shake was the one person in the region who did not need any introduction. His friends weren't sure if the judge liked being a regional celebrity, but they did know that Shake was secure in his fame. They thought that he was always at ease with the world. Judge Shake was satisfied that he had made the right decision. He just had to break it off with his lifelong friends. What he did not know was that his planned move to Chicago would eventually find him drawing down into a well of experience garnered during a very long lifetime in court to champion one final cause. He also had no idea he would find himself blowing his own horn to get things done in the Windy City. It was a Wednesday, barely 3 days before his 88th birthday. Shake was sitting as usual with half a dozen of his best friends for a kind of weekly ritual. You see, for years, every Wednesday they had met at the Midwest's oldest still operating eatery, Marone's. Between his burger and fries and his glass of Canada Dry and a dessert, he very abruptly told the assembled friends he was leaving his practice as the oldest still working attorney in all of Indiana, leaving a lifetime of good works, leaving his friends. Judge Shake was simply leaving. The decision was very abrupt indeed. It startled everyone at the table when he calmly announced it. He proclaimed his decision for his now impending departure during what started out as just another weekly luncheon with friends. Usually the group just sat and ate and talked and reminisced. And the members of the group had a lot to reminisce about. Shake spoke in a distinctive voice. It was deep and rich, but with a strong Hoosier twang. His recall at his age was amazing. There was no doubt that he could retell the proceedings of most of the cases in which he had been involved since his graduation from law school before World War I. He usually talked about his lifetime of pleading cases with a variety of levels involved. Some of the others also had been involved in the law in one way or another. Their stories were also legendary. Some were simply spellbinding. Although they were too erudite for most people, the Weekly Roundtable would have been a great informational radio show for NPR. One of the regulars was Lester Bilpak. He was a former congressional aide who had worked on Capitol Hill in Washington for some of the best-known members of Congress just after the Second World War. He often regaled the group with stories of such legislative giants as Styles Bridges, Harry Byrd Sr., Margaret Chase Smith, and John Foster Dulles. I always knew he would be Secretary of State someday, Bilpak often said about Dulles, but I never thought they'd name an airport after him. He gave that assessment of Dulles so often that many in the group anticipated hearing it each week. When Dulles's name was not mentioned during the luncheon, many wondered if Bilpak was slipping. The only female member of the weekly group was Amanda Grubb. She had taught school at the local university until an age requirement had forced her out a decade ago. It seemed she could remember the name of every student she ever had, when they graduated, what their major was, and what they looked like. She always smiled when she talked about her career in front of the blackboard or behind the counselor's desk. On some occasions, when one of her former students wandered into the restaurant, Grubb always yelled out his or her name. After each encounter with a former student, after they had gone to their own table, Grubb would always say, "What a nice kid, what a nice kid." The comment was sometimes comical because many of those nice kids were now old enough to have grandchildren in tow. Finally, a former newspaper editor, Jason Zimmer, rounded out the group. He had risen through the ranks to eventually become the editor-in-chief at one of the largest papers in the Southwest. He also had a lot to talk about. Next to Shake, he may have been the best storyteller in the Wednesday group at Marone's. Mr. Zimmer's career had begun in an era when the daily local paper in most towns was big and thick and filled with news and ads, and often had tons of supplements shoved in. By the time Zimmer retired, he realized that those days were dying. "It's all money now," he liked to say. "Papers have always been a cash cow for their owners, but in recent years, they're trying to milk the cow with every trick they can. I got sick of the corporate shenanigans. I was a journalist, not a salesman or an entertainer. Nobody cares what you write anymore, just so it doesn't rub one of the advertisers the wrong way. It's pathetic. I'm glad I'm out." Sadly, over the years, the Wednesday luncheon had shrunken in its membership. Long gone and sorely missed was Rudy Whitley. He had worked as news director of the local radio station. He was an overly talkative bear of a guy who loved country music. But unknown to most of his friends, he was a close confidant of the judge and an amateur historian and a sweetheart. Then there was Marshall Dillon. Yes, that was his real name. He was a multi-talented man who was active in nearly half a dozen local theater groups. Dillon had often traveled to New York City to see every major play or musical. Jack Lacey was perhaps the funniest former member. He had worked his tail off traveling the Midwest selling office equipment. All during his career, He had been a mover and shaker in Kiwanis. He once won the Captain of Kiwanis Award. Lacey prided himself in being one of the first salesmen to show his customers a brand new invention, the Xerox copier. Over the years, he'd collected a vast number of typewriters from the beginning of the typewriter age up to current times. The judge was given one of Lacey's collection as a present on his 80th birthday. It was the first thing he carefully wrapped up and packed when he planned his move to Chicago. But sadly, as the judge's friends had started to die off, Shake had begun to look less and less forward to those all too familiar and very ritualistic weekly meetings at the Prairie's oldest still-used restaurant. The fun was going out of it. Shake once remarked that he didn't want those weekly encounters to turn into a last man standing contest. He had told a friend, "It's not my intention that our Wednesdays turn into some kind of grim, emotional, ceremonial ritual with a bottle of wine to be stashed away for the ultimate survivor of the Wednesdays at Marone's Club. I don't want to see that happen. It's hard enough just to see the group dwindle without having some kind of ceremony to remind us that it's slowly and irrevocably happening, like a painfully slow avalanche." Judge Shake was determined to be the winner of any longevity contest. When the winner was announced and he was the last man there, he just didn't want to be sitting alone at Marone's on a Wednesday. Needless to say, his lifelong friends were shocked. "Where are you going?" they all asked. "Why? Is something wrong with you, Kurt? Are you sick? Or worse?" His answer was direct. He simply said, "By week's end, I'll be 88. It's about time I moved on. I'm going to a place I've been daydreaming about for months. It's not far away. You might even be able to drive to my funeral, if they ever bury me. And that is, if you want to be there." He smiled broadly, with no hesitation in his voice. He'd been rehearsing the speech for weeks. "I'm sure there are good restaurants there and new friends to be made, that's all I can tell you. I've made up my mind, and I'm doing this alone. And soon. Don't try to stop me. Next Wednesday, when all of you are gathered here, and trust me, you will be gathered here, I will be 250 miles away. Just pray that I'm doing the right thing." Over the years, Judge Curtis Shake had become a semi-wealthy man. He was not, though, as his career might suggest, living in the lap of luxury. He was, though, nonetheless able to live comfortably. And when his heavy decision to move was made months ago, he was able to quietly hire and pay enough people to secretly help him pack up 65 years of work in law and order and to arrange for a new apartment and the move to Chicago. Leaving was something he had thought about over and over. Just like a jury deliberating for a long time and with great effort, but now the verdict is in, he thought. Even the gut-wrenching day he finally did leave went very smoothly. The day before, he had taken the time to have some one-on-one private chats with those he would miss the most. He would treasure those final meetings. He had given small gifts to his oldest friends, mostly autographed editions of his award-winning history books. To one special friend, he gave a dusty old VHS copy of a major big Hollywood movie in which he had a special interest. To Jason Zimmer, the former newspaper editor, he gave a tied-up bundle of past issues of the local paper. He was an avid reader and had saved much of what he read. He didn't always agree with the paper's editorial stance, but as a historian, he had a great loyalty to the newspaper that had been the first ever paper on the American frontier. Its first edition hit the cobblestone streets of Vincennes in 1804, a full 12 years before Indiana became a state, and while the region was part of the old Northwest Territory, and Vincennes was the capital of that territory. It needed a newspaper, if for no other reason than to provide a place to publish legal notices. That obviously intrigued Shake. In the bundle were issues outlining Shake's trip to Europe in 1947, the Korean War, the Eisenhower years, the race for space, and one bittersweet issue trimmed in black, simply dated November 22nd, 1963. At the top of the pile was the front page of one of last week's editions. It described the test flight of the new space shuttle, the Enterprise. This might be valuable someday, he thought. There was little else Judge Shake shared as he left. There had been no press release to any area radio station. He was simply packing up and hitting the road. It was as simple as that. It was far too late to change anything. The judge was severing a tie that had bound him for nearly 90 years to the place where his heart lay. Vincennes was his real home, even during the time he had been called away to serve his country and humanity. On the day before he left, he had a longtime taxi driver friend, Jeff Young, take him around the city. He had Young take him past the 1874 Knox County Courthouse, where his strident voice had been heard in 1,000 cases. There are a lot of memories in there, he thought. He had made him make a final loop through the city's junior college, the oldest institute of higher learning in the U.S. outside the original 13 colonies. That is, if you don't count the college founded in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Judge Shake had studied at the Vincennes School as a young man, eventually getting a law degree at Indiana University in Bloomington well before the war to end all wars. While driving around the Vincennes campus, he remembered a time when the venerable old school was in only one building near the courthouse. He had lived through the sad years when the historic university nearly died. Then he saw a bright firebrand of a new school president, Isaac Beckus, be given free rein to change just about any aspect of the school he wanted to. In short order, Beckus quickly decided to resurrect the institution, move the campus to a city park, get donations to build new buildings, take over an abandoned brewery complex and use it for classrooms, start a nursing school, add a full-sized automobile mechanic school, build a mortuary science lab, construct a TV and radio station, and the first cable TV system in the Midwest, years ahead of its time. Beckus truly had single-handedly saved Shake's alma mater. Now the judge was damned proud of VU. Suddenly, it wasn't that one building relic of a school with a few hundred students, most taking business classes. Now it was a growing campus on the banks of the Wabash River, the center of study and activity for more than 10,000 students, many scattered all over southern Indiana at several campuses, and many more taking correspondence class. Through all the years, Judge Shake had found nothing to be ashamed of. Through all of it, he had risen to higher and higher levels of respectability. He had survived. He was not sure how it had happened. He only knew he was still here, and most of everything else had changed. Much of it, not for the better. The judge had his driver, Jeff Young, take him along the river, pausing to look at a huge bridge dedicated to Abraham Lincoln, where Lincoln and his family had crossed into Illinois when Abe was 21. Abe was a Hoosier, you know, he said. They drove past a massive memorial, the biggest outside of Washington, D.C., erected in honor of a mostly forgotten Revolutionary War hero who captured the fort at Vincennes and who secured the West for American expansion. Down another street was a tiny house where one of the nation's best-known clowns had grown up, Red Skelton. Red left Vincennes as a young man. I only waited 78 more years than Red did, Shake thought, as he and the driver passed by the home on Lyndale Avenue. Before returning to his all-but-empty home, he told Jeff to make a last stop at Marone's, the eatery where he and his aging friends met, since no one could remember. He told Jeff to leave the meter running and come in with him. He bought them both cheesecake. They both drank coffee. That was a rare drink for the judge. Neither said very much. Young sensed something was wrong. He had been the judge's wheels for more than a dozen years. By this time, he knew Shake well enough to not ask certain questions. The waitress was surprised to see the judge there on a Thursday. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," Shake then replied. "Actually, Diane, something is very, very right. At least it's going to be, I hope." He left a $100 tip for Diane. She didn't see it until he was long gone. "I'll have to give most of this back to him the next time I see him Wednesday. I'm sure it was a mistake," she said. That night, Judge Shake made one final inventory of the few remaining boxed-up belongings he still had. He was a guy who did everything methodically. He ran his life that way. But when someone would ask him about lists and folders and planning, he simply said, "I'm a lawyer. Organization is my middle name." He put himself to bed, satisfied, slept well. "You reach an age where you become too old to dream," he once told the Wednesday group. That night, he was true to his word. The judge often wished he could dream more, but that was something he had to force happen. In the morning, nearly 90 years of toil and concentration would end for a man who only wanted to be a country lawyer. Through no fault of his own, over the years he had become internationally known. His name would ever be connected to the Indiana Supreme Court and to one of the most important trials of the modern era. In many ways, this little man was a giant in his chosen profession. But to see him walk down the street, usually dressed in black, always with a cane, you wouldn't have a clue. Now more than ever, he was just fading into the landscape. Now, it was time to move on. And that's the end of Chapter 1 of Return to Nuremberg.